in the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every shadow and the enemy knows every rock and cave, 6 Navy SEALs found themselves staring at what seemed like their final moments. Surrounded by over 50 Taliban fighters on a barren hillside with nowhere to run, their ammunition running dangerously low and their radio crackling with static instead of salvation, these warriors faced the kind of nightmare that haunts every special operations soldier. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary rescue missions in modern military history. A story of brotherhood, sacrifice, and a single shot that changed everything. This isn't just another war story. This is about what happens when hope dies, and then something impossible brings it back to life. The date was October 15th, 2011. The place was the Hindu Kush Mountains, where heroes are made and legends are born. And sometimes where angels wear ghillie suits and carry .338 Lapua Magnum rifles. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and copper, but Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison knew that beauty in this part of the world was always dangerous. He adjusted his night vision goggles on his helmet and checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. 0547 hours. The 6-man SEAL team had been moving through the treacherous terrain for 8 hours, their target still 12 kilometers ahead. Morrison looked back at his team, spread out in tactical formation behind him. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Tank Rodriguez carried the heavy machine gun with the ease of a man handling a toy. His massive frame made him look like a walking mountain, but Morrison had seen Tank move through enemy territory with the silence of a ghost. Behind Tank, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Chun kept pace effortlessly, his medical bag secure on his back, ready to save lives or take them depending on what the mission required. Petty Officer Second Class Tyler Rabbit Johnson moved like his nickname suggested, quick and alert, his sniper rifle secured across his back. At 23, he was the youngest member of the team, but had already proven himself in more firefights than most soldiers see in their entire careers. Senior Chief Petty Officer Samuel Williams, the team's demolitions expert, brought up the rear with Petty Officer Third Class Alex Ghost Parker, whose ability to disappear into any environment had saved their lives more times than Morrison could count. The mission briefing had been straightforward, almost routine by SEAL standards. Intelligence reported that Ahmad Rashid, a high-value Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against NATO forces, was hiding in a compound deep in the mountains. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by peaks that offered excellent defensive positions for any enemy fighters. But intelligence also indicated that Rashid would only have a small security detail, maybe 8 to 10 men at most. Morrison had learned long ago not to trust intelligence reports completely. In his 8 years as a SEAL, he had seen too many routine missions turn into desperate fights for survival. That's why he had requested additional support for this operation, but command had denied his request. Resources were stretched thin across the theater, and this was classified as a standard capture or kill mission. The team moved in silence, communicating through hand signals and the kind of wordless understanding that comes only from years of training and combat together. Morrison had served with most of these men for over 2 years, and they functioned like a single organism, each member anticipating the other's movements and reactions. As they crested a ridge overlooking their target area, Morrison raised his fist, and the team immediately froze. Through his binoculars, he studied the compound below. It was larger than the intelligence photos had suggested, with multiple buildings and what looked like defensive positions dug into the surrounding hills. More concerning, he could see movement in those positions. Morrison counted at least 15 fighters visible around the compound, which meant there were probably twice that many hidden from view. The intelligence had been wrong, badly wrong. This wasn't a small security detail. This was a fortified position with enough firepower to hold off a much larger attacking force. He signaled for Chun to move up beside him. The medic was also the team's communications specialist, and Morrison needed to contact their command immediately. Chun pulled out the satellite radio and began trying to establish contact while Morrison continued his reconnaissance of the target area. The compound consisted of 3 main buildings arranged in a triangle, with the largest structure in the center. Rashid would most likely be in that central building, probably in a basement or underground bunker for maximum protection. The defensive positions on the surrounding hills were well concealed and positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire on any approaching force. Morrison realized that a direct assault would be suicide for a 6-man team. They needed to either call for backup or abort the mission and wait for a better opportunity. But as he was weighing these options, Chun tapped him on the shoulder and shook his head. The radio was getting nothing but static. They were on their own. The team leader made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of immediately withdrawing to a safe distance and trying to re-establish communications, he decided to move closer and gather more detailed intelligence. If they could confirm Rashid's presence and exact location, command might authorize a larger operation to capture or kill him. Morrison signaled for the team to begin a careful approach toward the compound. They would use the terrain to stay hidden while getting close enough to conduct detailed surveillance. It was a calculated risk, but one that Morrison felt was justified given the importance of their target. The team began moving down the reverse slope of the ridge, using a dry creek bed as concealment. The morning sun was rising higher, which would soon eliminate the shadows that provided their cover. They needed to be in position before full daylight exposed them to enemy observation. Tank took point as they moved through the creek bed, his machine gun ready to provide suppressing fire if they were discovered. The Big SEAL moved with surprising grace for someone his size, testing each step before putting his full weight down to avoid loose rocks that might clatter and give away their position. Behind Tank, Morrison monitored their surroundings while keeping track of their progress toward the compound. They had covered about half the distance when Ghost, who was providing rear security, tapped Morrison on the shoulder and pointed back the way they had come. Morrison turned and felt his blood turn to ice. Moving across the ridge they had just vacated were dozens of armed fighters. The SEALs had walked into a trap. The compound wasn't just a hiding place for Rashid. It was bait in a carefully planned ambush. Morrison immediately signaled for the team to take cover and began counting the enemy fighters he could see. 25, 30, 35 men were visible on the ridge above them, and more were emerging from concealed positions on the slopes around the compound. The SEALs were caught in a valley with enemies above them on all sides. Chun frantically worked with the radio, trying different frequencies and adjusting the antenna position to get a signal through the mountains. But the terrain that provided such good defensive positions for the enemy also blocked their communications with friendly forces. Morrison's mind raced through their options. They could try to fight their way back up the slope they had descended, but that would mean charging uphill against superior numbers and defensive positions. They could try to reach the compound and use it for cover, but that would put them in the middle of the enemy's prepared killing zone. Or they could try to find another way out of the valley, but Morrison's map study had shown this valley had only one practical exit, and the enemy was already moving to block it. The Taliban fighters seemed to be in no hurry to engage the SEALs. They were taking their time, moving into position to ensure that none of the Americans could escape. Morrison realized that their enemies wanted to capture them alive, if possible. 6 Navy SEALs would be an incredible propaganda victory for the Taliban. Tank had set up his machine gun behind a large boulder and was scanning for targets. Morrison could see the determination in the Big SEAL's eyes. If they were going to die here, Tank was ready to take as many enemies with him as possible. The other team members had also taken up defensive positions among the rocks in the creek bed. Morrison checked his ammunition. He had 4 magazines left for his rifle plus his sidearm. Looking at his teammates, he could see they were all running low on ammunition. This was supposed to be a quick strike mission, not an extended firefight, so they hadn't brought heavy combat loads. The enemy fighters were now close enough that Morrison could hear them calling to each other in Pashto. They were coordinating their movements, probably planning to rush the SEALs' position from multiple directions simultaneously. Morrison knew that once that assault began, his team would last only minutes. Chen suddenly grabbed Morrison's arm and pointed to his radio. He was getting something faint but audible. Morrison could hear a distant voice speaking English, asking for their status and location. Chen quickly responded with their coordinates and situation, emphasizing that they needed immediate close air support or extraction. The response was devastating. No aircraft were available for immediate support, and the nearest ground forces were over 50 kilometers away. The SEALs were told to evade and escape if possible, or to find a defensible position and wait for help that might not arrive for hours. Morrison looked at his men, these warriors who had followed him into this deadly trap. Tank was calmly adjusting his machine gun sights. Chen was still working with the radio, trying to reach anyone who might be able to help. Rabbit had his sniper rifle ready, looking for high-value targets among the enemy fighters. Williams was checking his demolitions, probably planning to take some enemies with him if they were overrun. Ghost was studying the terrain, looking for any possible escape route. These men trusted him completely, and he had led them into what looked like certain death or capture. Morrison made another decision. If they were going to die here, they would die fighting, and they would make the enemy pay dearly for their victory. He was about to give the order to open fire when the first shots rang out from the enemy positions above them. The battle for survival had begun. The first bullets struck the rocks around their position with sharp cracks that echoed through the valley. Morrison immediately shouted orders to his team as they came under fire from multiple directions. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to create a deadly crossfire that would eventually force the SEALs from their limited cover. Tank opened up with his machine gun, sending long bursts toward the enemy positions on the eastern slope. The heavy rounds shattered rocks and forced several fighters to duck behind cover, but Morrison could see that there were too many targets for one machine gun to suppress effectively. The enemy return fire intensified, forcing Tank to keep his head down between bursts. Rabbit had found a small gap between two boulders that gave him a clear field of fire toward the ridge where the largest concentration of enemy fighters was positioned. Morrison watched as the young sniper took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. 800 meters away, a Taliban fighter fell backward and didn't get up. Rabbit immediately shifted his aim and fired again, dropping a second enemy who had been trying to advance to a better position. The precision fire from Rabbit's sniper rifle seemed to anger the Taliban fighters, and the volume of incoming fire increased dramatically. Bullets were striking all around the SEALs' position now, sending rock chips flying and filling the air with dust and debris. Morrison realized that their enemy had enough ammunition to keep up this rate of fire for hours if necessary. Chen was still working frantically with the radio, trying to reach anyone who might be able to provide support. Between the mountains blocking their signals and the noise of the firefight, he was having little success. Occasionally, he would get a brief transmission, but not long enough to coordinate any kind of rescue operation. Williams had positioned himself to cover the southern approach to their position, where a group of enemy fighters was trying to work their way down through the rocks to get closer. The demolitions expert was using his rifle with surgical precision, placing shots that forced the advancing Taliban fighters to seek cover rather than continue their advance. Ghost was covering the northern flank, where another group of enemies was attempting a flanking maneuver. Morrison could see the concern in Ghost's eyes as he tracked multiple targets moving through the terrain above them. The enemy was being smart, using the terrain to their advantage and advancing in small groups that were hard to target effectively. Morrison took stock of their situation. They were surrounded by an estimated 50 to 60 enemy fighters who held all the high ground around their position. Their ammunition was limited, their communications were sporadic at best, and help was hours away if it came at all. The enemy seemed content to keep them pinned down while gradually tightening the noose around their position. The Taliban fighters were disciplined and well-trained, not the ragtag militia that some intelligence reports suggested. They were moving with purpose and coordination, suggesting they had planned this ambush carefully. Morrison wondered how long they had been watching his team's approach and whether their communications have been intercepted somehow. Tank's machine gun suddenly went silent, and Morrison looked over to see the big SEAL changing his barrel. The weapon had overheated from sustained fire, and Tank needed to swap in a fresh barrel before continuing. During the brief lull in covering fire, several enemy fighters attempted to advance, forcing Rabbit and Williams to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Morrison could hear voices calling in Pashto from the enemy positions. He understood enough of the language to know they were coordinating an assault on the SEAL's position. The enemy commander was smart enough to know that time was on his side. He could afford to be patient and methodical, wearing down the Americans' ammunition and resolve before moving in for the kill. Chin suddenly grabbed Morrison's arm and pointed to his radio. He had managed to establish contact with a forward operating base about 40 kilometers away. Morrison took the handset and quickly briefed the base commander on their situation. The response was not encouraging. No close air support was immediately available, and the nearest ground forces were engaged in operations elsewhere. The base commander did have one piece of potentially useful information. A single sniper team was operating in the general area, but they were at least 15 kilometers away and might not be able to reach the SEAL's position in time to be useful. Morrison took down their radio frequency and call sign, knowing it was probably futile but unwilling to give up any chance of survival. The firefight had been going on for over an hour now, and Morrison could see that his team's ammunition was running dangerously low. Tank was down to his last belt of machine gun ammunition. Rabbit had only a few rounds left for his sniper rifle. The others were rationing their rifle ammunition, taking only carefully aimed shots at the most threatening targets. Morrison made a difficult decision. He ordered his team to conserve their remaining ammunition and only engage targets that posed an immediate threat to their position. This meant allowing some enemy fighters to advance closer than he would have liked, but they needed to make every shot count if they were going to survive long enough for help to arrive. The Taliban fighters seemed to sense that the Americans' fire was slackening, and they began to press their advance more aggressively. Groups of fighters started moving down the slopes from multiple directions, using covering fire from their comrades to advance from one piece of cover to the next. Williams spotted a particularly dangerous threat approaching from the south. A team of Taliban fighters was carrying what looked like an RPG launcher, trying to get close enough to use it against the SEAL's position. Williams took careful aim and fired, dropping the fighter carrying the launcher. But another fighter immediately picked up the weapon and continued advancing. Morrison realized that if the enemy got that RPG into position, it would be game over for his team. Their rocky cover might stop rifle bullets, but it wouldn't survive a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. He grabbed his rifle and joined Williams in trying to stop the advancing RPG team. Ghost called out a warning from the northern perimeter. Another group of enemy fighters was making a coordinated advance on that side, and he was having trouble stopping all of them with his limited ammunition. Morrison could see that the enemy was finally ready to make their final assault on the SEAL's position. Tank finished reloading his machine gun and immediately engaged the largest group of advancing fighters. His heavy fire forced them to take cover, but Morrison could see more enemy fighters moving to replace those who had been stopped. The Taliban commander was throwing his fighters at the SEAL's position in waves, knowing that eventually the Americans would run out of ammunition. Chin was still working with the radio, trying to contact the sniper team that might be in the area. Finally, he managed to establish contact. The team consisted of 2 Marine snipers who had been conducting their own reconnaissance mission when they heard about the SEAL's situation. They were trying to reach a position where they might be able to provide support, but the terrain was slowing their movement. Morrison took the radio and spoke directly to the Marine sniper team leader. Staff Sergeant Mike Hawk Peterson had been a sniper for 6 years and had operated in Afghanistan for 3 tours. His spotter, Corporal Jason Eagle Martinez, was equally experienced. Both men were willing to attempt a rescue operation, but they needed to get within range first. Peterson's calm voice over the radio was reassuring, but Morrison knew that even the best snipers would have difficulty affecting the outcome of this battle unless they could get into an ideal position. The enemy had too many fighters spread across too wide an area for two snipers to neutralize effectively. The Taliban fighters were now close enough that Morrison could see their faces clearly. These weren't desperate fighters making a suicidal charge. They were disciplined soldiers executing a carefully planned assault. They moved with purpose and coordination, using hand signals to communicate and advancing in overlapping bounds that provided mutual support. Morrison counted his remaining ammunition. 3 magazines left for his rifle, plus his sidearm. Looking at his teammates, he could see they were in similar situations. Tank's machine gun was almost out of ammunition, and once that weapon fell silent, their defensive firepower would be drastically reduced. The enemy commander seemed to be waiting for something before launching his final assault. Morrison wondered if reinforcements were coming or if they were simply waiting for the Americans to exhaust their ammunition completely. Either way, the SEALs were running out of time and options. Rabbit suddenly called out that he had spotted what looked like a command element among the enemy fighters. Morrison looked through his binoculars and saw a group of 5 men positioned on the eastern ridge who seemed to be directing the movements of the other fighters. If Rabbit could eliminate the enemy commander, it might disrupt their coordinated assault long enough for help to arrive. Morrison gave Rabbit permission to take the shot, knowing it would reveal the sniper's position to the enemy, but hoping it might buy them precious time. Rabbit took careful aim, accounting for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. Through his binoculars, Morrison watched one of the command group fall, but the others immediately took cover and the assault continued. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters were now within 50 meters of their position on multiple sides, and Morrison could hear them calling to each other as they prepared for their final rush. Once that assault began, the SEAL's small arms fire would not be enough to stop it. Shin managed to re-establish contact with Peterson's sniper team. They had reached a position on a ridge about 2 kilometers away where they had a clear view of part of the valley. Peterson reported that he could see the SEAL's position and some of the enemy fighters, but the angle was difficult and the range was at the extreme limit of his rifle's effective distance. Morrison made a desperate request. He asked Peterson to engage any targets he could identify, hoping that sniper fire from an unexpected direction might disrupt the enemy's assault. Peterson acknowledged the request and said he was looking for the best targets. The Taliban fighters were making their final preparations for the assault on the SEAL's position. Morrison could see them gathering in groups, checking their weapons, and receiving final instructions from their leaders. Within minutes, they would come at the Americans from all sides simultaneously. Morrison looked at his men one last time. Despite their desperate situation, he could see no fear in their eyes, only determination and the grim acceptance of warriors who had always known this day might come. They had fought together, and they would die together if necessary, but they would not surrender. The first wave of attackers began their charge. The Taliban fighters emerged from their cover positions like a human avalanche, charging down the slopes toward the SEAL's defensive position with wild battle cries echoing through the valley. Morrison counted at least 30 fighters in the first wave, with more following behind. The coordinated assault was everything he had feared it would be. Tank opened up with his machine gun, sweeping long bursts across the advancing fighters. The heavy rounds cut down several attackers in the first seconds, but there were too many targets advancing from too many directions. Morrison could see Tank's jaw set in grim determination as he traversed his weapon back and forth, trying to stop as many attackers as possible with his remaining ammunition. Rabbit had switched to his sidearm after expending his last sniper rifle round. The young SEAL was engaging targets at close range now, his training taking over as muscle memory guided his movements. Each shot was deliberate and accurate, but Morrison could see the concern in Rabbit's eyes as enemy fighters continued to advance despite his efforts. Williams was fighting a desperate battle against the Southern Assault Group, which included the fighters with the RPG launcher. The demolitions expert had already thrown 2 grenades to disrupt their advance, but they kept coming. Morrison could hear the distinctive whoosh of an RPG launch and immediately shouted a warning to his team. The rocket-propelled grenade struck a boulder about 10 meters from their position, sending rock fragments flying through the air like shrapnel. The explosion was deafening in the confined space of the creek bed, and Morrison felt his ears ringing as dust and debris rained down on them. Miraculously, none of his team members appeared to be seriously wounded. Ghost was engaging multiple targets on the northern approach, his rifle cracking repeatedly as he tried to slow the advancing fighters. Morrison could see that the enemy was using effective small unit tactics, with some fighters providing covering fire while others advanced. It was a professional military operation, not the desperate attack of untrained insurgents. Chen was still working frantically with the radio, trying to coordinate with Peterson's sniper team while simultaneously engaging enemy fighters with his rifle. Morrison could hear him calling out grid coordinates and target descriptions, hoping the Marine snipers could provide some relief to their desperate situation. Peterson's voice crackled over the radio, reporting that he had eyes on multiple enemy fighters but was having difficulty getting clear shots due to the terrain and the chaotic nature of the battle. The Marine sniper was doing his best to help, but 2 men with rifles could only do so much against 50 attackers spread across a wide area. Morrison realized that Tank's machine gun had gone silent. Looking over, he saw the Big SEAL examining his weapon with a grim expression. The machine gun had jammed or run out of ammunition. Morrison couldn't tell which, but either way, their heaviest weapon was now out of action. The loss of that suppressing fire would make their situation even more desperate. The enemy fighters seemed to sense that the Americans' defensive fire was weakening, and they pressed their assault with renewed vigor. Morrison could see fighters advancing to within 30 meters of their position, close enough that he could make out individual faces and expressions. These men were determined to overrun the SEALs' position and capture or kill every American in the valley. Morrison made a difficult decision. He ordered his team to prepare for close combat, knowing that within minutes the enemy fighters would be on top of their position. Each SEAL checked his sidearm and knife, preparing for the kind of hand-to-hand fighting that would determine who lived and who died in the next few minutes. Tank had abandoned his jammed machine gun and drawn his sidearm, but Morrison could see the Big SEAL looking around for something else to use as a weapon. Tank picked up a large rock in his left hand while keeping his pistol in his right. Morrison had seen Tank in close combat before and knew the Big SEAL would account for himself, well, even without his primary weapon. Williams suddenly shouted a warning. The RPG team had moved close enough to get another shot, and they were taking aim directly at the center of the SEAL's position. Morrison could see the fighter shouldering the launcher, preparing to fire at point-blank range. At this distance, there would be no surviving the blast. Peterson's rifle cracked from his distant position, and Morrison saw the RPG gunner suddenly spin and fall backward. The Marine sniper had made an incredible shot at over 2,000 meters, threading his bullet through the chaos of the battle to eliminate the most immediate threat to the SEAL's survival. But Morrison could see another fighter moving to pick up the launcher. Rabbit engaged the new RPG gunner with his sidearm, but the range was too great for accurate pistol fire. The Taliban fighter was taking his time, knowing that the Americans couldn't stop him from this distance. Morrison could see the man settling into a firing position, the RPG launcher steady on his shoulder. Chin suddenly grabbed Morrison's arm and pointed to his radio with excitement. He had managed to contact a different military unit, and they had assets in the area. Morrison took the handset and heard the voice of an Air Force pilot reporting that he was 5 minutes out with a pair of A-10 attack aircraft. The pilot was requesting immediate target information and coordinates for close air support. Morrison quickly passed the coordinates of their position and began describing the enemy locations around them. The pilot acknowledged and said he could see the valley through his targeting systems. But 5 minutes was still an eternity when enemy fighters were 30 meters away and closing fast. The Taliban assault was reaching its climax now. Morrison could see fighters approaching their position from 3 different directions, and his team's ammunition was nearly exhausted. They had perhaps 1 magazine each remaining, certainly not enough to stop the number of attackers bearing down on them. Ghost called out that enemy fighters were flanking their position to the north and would soon be behind them. Once the Taliban fighters got into their rear area, the SEALs would be completely surrounded with no possibility of escape. Morrison made another desperate decision. He ordered his team to consolidate their remaining ammunition and prepare for a fighting withdrawal to a secondary position. But as Morrison looked around for a place to withdraw to, he realized there wasn't one. The creek bed that had provided their initial cover was surrounded by higher ground on all sides. Any movement away from their current position would expose them to fire from multiple directions and make them easy targets for the advancing fighters. Tank had found an old Soviet-era rifle among the rocks, probably dropped by a fighter in an earlier engagement. The big SEAL quickly checked the weapon and found it was loaded and functional. Morrison watched Tank shoulder the AK-47 and begin engaging targets with the familiarity of a professional soldier who could use any weapon effectively. Williams had thrown his last grenade at the Southern Assault Group, temporarily disrupting their advance, but not stopping it entirely. The demolitions expert was down to his sidearm now, and Morrison could see him calculating distances and angles as the enemy fighters closed in on their position. Peterson's voice came over the radio again, reporting that he had engaged several more targets, but that the enemy was using the terrain effectively to limit his shots. The Marine sniper was doing everything possible to help, but he was fighting his own battle against distance, terrain, and time. Morrison realized that the A-10 aircraft would arrive too late to affect the immediate outcome of the battle. The Taliban fighters would overrun their position within the next 2 minutes, and there was nothing the SEALs could do to stop them. Morrison began to prepare himself mentally for the final fight, determined to take as many enemies with him as possible. The enemy fighters were close enough now that Morrison could hear their breathing and footsteps on the rocky ground. Some were calling to their comrades in Pashto, coordinating their final assault. Morrison could see the determination in their eyes and knew that these men were prepared to die to achieve their objective. Chin was still calling out coordinates to the approaching aircraft, but Morrison knew it was probably futile. The A-10s would arrive to find either dead Americans or capture prisoners, not a fight they could effect. But Chun continued his professional duties even as enemy fighters approached their position with rifles ready. Tank suddenly roared a battle cry and charged toward the largest group of advancing fighters. The Big SEAL's unexpected counterattack caught the Taliban fighters off guard, and Morrison watched Tank engage 3 men simultaneously with his captured rifle and his bare hands. It was an incredible display of warrior spirit, but Morrison knew Tank couldn't hold off the entire assault by himself. Morrison made his final decision as a team leader. He ordered his remaining men to fix bayonets and prepare to follow Tank's example. If they were going to die in this valley, they would die as SEALs, fighting to the last man and making their enemies pay dearly for their victory. The final assault was beginning, and Morrison could see enemy fighters emerging from cover all around their position. In seconds, the battle would become a desperate melee of close-quarters combat where training and determination would matter more than ammunition or superior numbers. Morrison raised his rifle and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible, knowing that his team had fought with honor and courage even in the face of impossible odds. These were his brothers, and they would face death together as they had faced everything else in their military careers. The Taliban fighters raised their weapons and prepared to overrun the SEALs' position when something unexpected happened that would change the course of the battle. The crack of Peterson's rifle echoed across the valley like thunder, and Morrison watched in amazement as the Taliban fighter closest to their position suddenly dropped his weapon and fell backward. The Marine sniper had somehow managed to thread another impossible shot through the chaos of the battle, eliminating the most immediate threat to the SEAL's survival. But what happened next was even more extraordinary. Peterson's spotter, Martinez, had been carefully studying the enemy positions through his spotting scope, mapping out the locations of key fighters and identifying the most dangerous threats. Working together, the 2 Marines had developed a plan that would either save the SEALs or die trying. Peterson began engaging targets with mechanical precision, his rifle cracking every few seconds as he worked through a predetermined list of high-value targets. Morrison watched enemy fighters drop one by one as the Marine sniper demonstrated why he was considered one of the best marksmen in the Corps. Each shot was perfectly placed, eliminating fighters who were in position to cause maximum damage to the SEALs. Martinez was calling out targets and wind corrections to Peterson while simultaneously coordinating with Chun over the radio. The young Marine had taken control of the close air support mission, providing precise coordinates and target descriptions to the approaching A-10 pilots. His calm, professional voice cut through the chaos of the firefight. Tank had been surrounded by 5 Taliban fighters when Peterson's covering fire began. The Big SEAL used the distraction caused by the sniper fire to break free from the enemy fighters closing in on him. Morrison watched Tank grab a fallen fighter's rifle and begin working his way back toward their main defensive position, laying down suppressing fire as he moved. The Taliban assault began to falter as their fighters started falling to Peterson's precision shooting. The enemy commander was trying to reorganize his forces, but Peterson was systematically eliminating anyone who showed leadership qualities or who was carrying crew-served weapons. The Marine sniper's intervention was disrupting the coordinated nature of the enemy attack. Williams had managed to reach the abandoned RPG launcher and was attempting to turn it against the enemy positions. The demolitions expert quickly figured out how to operate the weapon and loaded one of the remaining rockets. Morrison watched Williams take careful aim at a group of fighters who had taken cover behind a large boulder on the eastern slope. The RPG struck the boulder with a tremendous explosion, sending rock fragments flying and forcing the enemy fighters to abandon their position. Williams immediately began loading another rocket, intending to continue using the enemy's own weapon against them. Morrison felt a surge of hope as he watched his team begin to fight back effectively. Rabbit had found additional ammunition among the enemy casualties and was back in action with a captured AK-47. The young SEAL was using his sniper training to make every shot count, carefully selecting targets that would have maximum impact on the enemy's ability to coordinate their assault. Morrison could see Rabbit's confidence returning as he began to affect the outcome of the battle. Ghost had identified the enemy commander among the fighters on the northern slope and was working to get into position for a shot. Morrison could see Ghost moving carefully through the rocks, using the terrain to conceal his approach while Peterson's covering fire kept the enemy fighters pinned down. If Ghost could eliminate the enemy commander, it might break their will to continue the assault. Chun was coordinating multiple radio conversations simultaneously, talking to Peterson's team, the approaching A-10 pilots, and a helicopter gunship that had diverted from another mission to provide assistance. Morrison could hear the professional competence in Chen's voice as he managed the complex coordination required to bring all these assets to bear on their situation. Peterson's rifle had been firing continuously for several minutes now, and Morrison wondered how much ammunition the Marine sniper had remaining. Each shot had been perfectly placed, eliminating specific threats and disrupting the enemy's assault, but Morrison knew that even the best sniper couldn't sustain this rate of fire indefinitely. Martinez came over the radio with devastating news. Peterson was down to his last few rounds of ammunition, and the enemy was beginning to adapt to the sniper fire by using better cover and concealment. The Marines had bought the SEALs precious time, but they couldn't continue to provide the same level of support for much longer. Morrison realized that they needed to use the time Peterson had bought them to improve their tactical situation. He ordered his team to begin moving to a better defensive position while the enemy was still disrupted by the sniper fire. They needed to find cover that would protect them until the air support arrived. Tank had fought his way back to the main group and immediately took charge of their movement to the new position. The Big SEAL identified a cluster of boulders about 50 meters away that would provide better protection from multiple directions. Morrison agreed with Tank's assessment and ordered the team to begin moving immediately. Williams fired his second RPG round at another enemy position, scoring a direct hit on a group of fighters who had been preparing to assault the SEALs' flanks. The explosion sent enemy fighters scattering, and created enough confusion to cover the SEALs' movement to their new position. Williams grabbed the remaining rockets and began moving with his teammates. Ghost had worked his way into position and taken his shot at the enemy commander. Morrison saw the Taliban leader fall, and immediately the enemy's coordinated assault began to break down into smaller, less organized attacks. The loss of their commander was having exactly the effect Ghost had hoped for. Rabbit was providing covering fire for the team's movement, engaging any enemy fighters who tried to pursue them to their new position. The young SEAL was making excellent use of the captured enemy rifle, demonstrating the adaptability that made SEALs so effective in combat situations. Morrison could see that Rabbit was gaining confidence with each successful engagement. Peterson managed to eliminate 2 more enemy fighters who were trying to coordinate a renewed assault, but Martinez reported that the Marine sniper was now down to his last round. The Marines had given everything they had to support the SEALs, but their ammunition was exhausted. From now on, Peterson and Martinez would be observers only, unable to affect the battle directly. The SEALs reached their new defensive position just as the first 10 attack aircraft arrived on station. Morrison could hear the distinctive sound of the aircraft's engines as it circled the valley, and Chen was already in radio contact with the pilot, providing detailed target information and coordinates for the remaining enemy positions. Martinez had taken over the coordination with the A-10 pilot, using his spotting scope to identify the most dangerous enemy positions and guide the aircraft's attacks. The young Marine's calm professionalism was exactly what was needed to make the close air support effective without endangering the SEALs on the ground. The first attack run by the A-10 was devastating. Morrison watched as the aircraft's 30mm cannon raked the eastern slope where the largest concentration of enemy fighters was positioned. The distinctive sound of the Gu-8 cannon was unmistakable, and Morrison could see enemy fighters abandoning their positions as the aircraft's fire walked across their location. Williams had set up the captured RPG launcher in their new position and was scanning for targets of opportunity. The demolitions expert identified a group of enemy fighters who were trying to reposition to engage the circling aircraft and fired his 3rd rocket at their location. The explosions scattered the fighters and prevented them from setting up effective anti-aircraft fire. The second day, 10 began its attack run on the northern slope where Ghost had eliminated the enemy commander. The pilot was using cluster bombs this time, and Morrison watched as the ordnance blanketed the enemy positions with devastating effect. The combined impact of the airstrikes and Peterson's earlier precision fire was breaking the enemy's will to continue the fight. Tank was counting the remaining enemy fighters and estimating their capabilities. The Big SEAL reported to Morrison that the enemy force had been reduced by at least 60%, and the survivors appeared to be trying to withdraw rather than continue their assault. The tide of the battle had finally turned in favor of the Americans. Chen received word that the helicopter gunship was now 5 minutes out and would be available to pursue any fleeing enemy fighters. The pilot was requesting permission to engage targets of opportunity as the Taliban fighters attempted to escape the valley. Morrison gave his approval, knowing that eliminating as many enemy fighters as possible would prevent them from planning future attacks. Rabbit had found a position where he could observe the enemy withdrawal and was calling out target locations to the circling aircraft. The young SEAL's training in target identification and coordination was proving invaluable in directing the airstrikes effectively. Morrison could see that Rabbit had developed into an outstanding combat leader during this engagement. Ghost was providing security for their new position while simultaneously coordinating with Peterson's team to ensure that all enemy positions had been identified and engaged. The SEAL's attention to detail was ensuring that no enemy fighters remained hidden in the rocks where they could threaten the team later. Morrison realized that his team had survived the impossible. They had been surrounded and outnumbered 10-1, with limited ammunition and no immediate hope of rescue. Yet they had fought their way out of certain death through a combination of skill, determination, and the incredible support provided by Peterson's Marine sniper team. The helicopter gunship arrived, and began pursuing the fleeing Taliban fighters, its chain gun and rockets eliminating vehicles and personnel who were trying to escape the valley. Morrison could hear the pilot reporting successful engagements as he hunted down the survivors of the failed ambush. Peterson's voice came over the radio one final time, congratulating the SEALs on their successful defense and reporting that the immediate threat had been eliminated. The Marine sniper and his spotter had expended all their ammunition and taken significant risks to save 6 men they had never met, demonstrating the brotherhood that exists among all American warriors. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the valley as a medevac bird approached their position 3 hours after the last shots had been fired. Morrison looked around at his team, checking each man for injuries he might have missed in the heat of battle. Tank had taken shrapnel in his left arm from the RPG explosion, but had continued fighting without complaint. Chun had a deep cut on his forehead from flying rock fragments, but the medic had patched himself up between radio calls. Williams was examining the captured enemy equipment, documenting serial numbers and markings that might provide intelligence value. The demolitions expert had counted over 40 enemy casualties scattered around the valley, testament to the effectiveness of their desperate defense and the devastating impact of Peterson's precision shooting and the airstrikes that followed. Rabbit was still scanning the surrounding ridges through his scope, ensuring that no enemy fighters remained hidden in the rocks where they could threaten the incoming helicopter. The young SEAL had proven himself completely during the battle, demonstrating both the technical skills and the mental toughness required for special operations. Ghost had established a security perimeter around their position and was coordinating with the helicopter crew to ensure a safe landing zone. Morrison could see the professional competence that had made Ghost such an effective team member throughout their deployment. Each man had performed his duties with distinction under impossible circumstances. Morrison himself was dealing with the emotional aftermath of leading his team into what had nearly been a deadly trap. The intelligence failure that had resulted in their walking into a prepared ambush would require a thorough investigation. But Morrison knew that second-guessing tactical decisions made under combat conditions was a luxury that would have to wait. Chen was coordinating the medical evacuation of 2 seriously wounded Taliban fighters who had been captured during the airstrikes. Despite being enemies who had tried to kill them just hours earlier, the SEALs provided medical care to the wounded fighters according to the Geneva Conventions and their own professional standards. The helicopter landed in a cloud of dust and debris, and Morrison watched as Peterson and Martinez climbed out of the aircraft. Morrison had requested that the Marine snipers be brought to the valley so he could thank them personally for their actions. He wanted to look these men in the eyes and express his gratitude for saving his team's lives. Peterson was a lean, weathered Marine in his early 30s with the calm confidence of a professional warrior. Martinez was younger, perhaps 25, but Morrison could see the same quiet competence in his eyes. Both Marines carried themselves with the unpretentious professionalism that Morrison associated with the best snipers he had known. Morrison approached Peterson and extended his hand, but the Marine sniper pulled him into an embrace instead. No words were necessary between warriors who understood the bonds created by shared combat. Peterson had risked everything to save 6 men he had never met, and Morrison would carry that debt for the rest of his life. Tank limped over to join the conversation, his wounded arm bandaged but still functional. The Big SEAL wanted to thank Martinez personally for his role in coordinating the close air support that had turned the tide of the battle. Morrison could see the mutual respect between these men who had fought together without ever being in the same location. Williams had gathered intelligence materials from the enemy positions, including maps and communications equipment that might provide information about other Taliban operations in the area. The demolitions expert was already thinking about how this battle might affect future missions and what lessons could be learned from their experience. Rabbit approached Peterson with questions about long-range shooting techniques and equipment recommendations. The young SEAL was eager to learn from one of the Corps' best snipers, and Peterson seemed happy to share his knowledge with a fellow professional. Morrison could see that Rabbit would carry these lessons into future operations. Ghost was documenting the entire battle for the after-action report, taking photographs of key terrain features and enemy positions. The intelligence gathered from this engagement would help other units avoid similar ambushes and might reveal important information about enemy tactics and capabilities in this area of operations. Chun was coordinating with the helicopter crew to ensure that all wounded personnel, both American and enemy, received appropriate medical care during the flight back to the forward operating base. The medic's attention to detail and professional standards had probably saved lives during the battle, and he continued to demonstrate those same qualities after the fighting ended. Morrison learned that Peterson and Martinez had been conducting their own reconnaissance mission when they received the call for help. The two Marines had abandoned their original objectives and moved over 15 kilometers of difficult terrain to reach a position where they could provide support to the SEALs. Their selfless actions had made the difference between survival and disaster. The helicopter crew reported that the valley was secure and that no additional enemy forces had been detected in the surrounding area. The Taliban fighters who had planned and executed the ambush were either dead, captured, or had fled the region entirely. The immediate threat to American forces in this area had been eliminated. Morrison gathered his team for a final equipment check before boarding the helicopter for extraction. Each man accounted for his weapons and gear, ensuring that no sensitive materials would be left behind for the enemy to recover. Despite their exhaustion, the SEALs maintained their professional standards even in the aftermath of combat. The flight back to the forward operating base gave Morrison time to reflect on the events of the day and the lessons learned from their experience. The intelligence failure that had led to their walking into the ambush would need to be addressed to prevent similar incidents in the future. But Morrison also recognized that his team's training and determination had enabled them to survive against impossible odds. Peterson and Martinez rode with the SEALs on the return flight, and Morrison used the time to learn more about their backgrounds and experience. Both Marines were career soldiers who had dedicated their lives to serving their country and their fellow warriors. Their actions in support of the SEAL team exemplified the finest traditions of the American military. Tank was receiving medical attention for his shrapnel wounds during the flight, but he insisted on remaining conscious and alert until the team reached safety. Morrison could see that the Big SEAL was still processing the events of the battle and would probably need time to fully understand how close they had come to disaster. Williams was already thinking about how the captured enemy equipment and intelligence materials might be exploited to prevent future attacks. The demolitions expert understood that their survival meant nothing if the lessons learned from this engagement were not passed on to other units operating in the region. Rabbit was still energized by the combat experience and was eager to discuss tactics and techniques with Peterson and Martinez. Morrison could see that the young SEAL had gained confidence and maturity during the battle, developing into the kind of warrior who would be invaluable in future operations. Ghost remained alert and professional throughout the flight, maintaining security awareness even though they were now in friendly airspace. Morrison appreciated this attention to detail and recognized that Ghost's vigilance had probably saved their lives multiple times during the battle. Chun was monitoring the condition of the wounded enemy prisoners during the flight, ensuring that they received appropriate medical care despite their status as combatants who had recently been trying to kill American soldiers. Morrison respected this demonstration of professional ethics and medical responsibility. The forward operating base appeared ahead of them, and Morrison felt a sense of relief as they approached the landing zone. His team had survived their trial by fire and had proven themselves worthy of the SEAL trident they wore. But Morrison also knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war, and there would be other challenges ahead. As the helicopter touched down, Morrison looked at each of his teammates one final time. These men had followed him into hell and had fought their way back out through skill, courage, and determination. They had been tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and had emerged stronger for the experience. Peterson and Martinez prepared to transfer to another aircraft that would take them back to their own unit. Before they left, Morrison shook hands with both Marines one final time, knowing that he would probably never see them again, but would never forget what they had done for his team. The debriefing would come later, along with the paperwork and the official reports that would document their experience for military historians and future generations of warriors. But for now, Morrison was simply grateful that all 6 members of his team were walking off that helicopter alive and ready to continue their mission. The bond forged between these men in the mountains of Afghanistan would last for the rest of their lives. They had faced death together and had emerged victorious through a combination of training, determination, and the brotherhood that exists among warriors who serve their country with honor and distinction. Morrison knew that the memory of Peterson's impossible shots and Martinez's calm coordination under pressure would inspire his team for years to come. The Marine snipers had demonstrated that even in the darkest moments, help could come from unexpected directions when warriors were willing to risk everything for their brothers in arms. As they walked across the landing zone toward the base facilities, Morrison felt the weight of command and the responsibility he carried for his team's lives. But he also felt pride in their performance and confidence in their ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead in their continuing mission against America's enemies. The battle in the valley would become part of SEAL legend, a story told in training schools and operations centers around the world. But for Morrison and his team, it would always be remembered as the day when impossible odds were overcome through courage, skill, and the selfless actions of 2 Marine snipers who answered the call when warriors needed help. The war would continue, and there would be other battles and other challenges. But Morrison knew that his team had proven themselves under the ultimate test of combat, and they would carry the lessons learned from this experience into every future operation. They had survived their trial by fire and had emerged as better warriors and better men.